Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. In my last video, which I entitled Docker in Incus is Awesome, I took Brian, the open source advocate's application that he developed to manage lists called GetMy, and I implemented it in Docker OCI containers. So this time we're going to do a quick review here of that application and what we did. Basically, we created a database container for the Mongo database, which he uses. And then next, we created an application container for the GetMy application. Both of those containers were Docker OCI containers implemented in Incus. After creating the containers, we created a data directory called GetMyData on the Incus host, and then we mapped that container or a folder on the host back to the database container here. And then after that, we went ahead and set up a port alias for the main application so that you could connect to it. And then we started the database container, and then we started the application. And then from there, we were able to access the application. So this time, we're going to do something just a little bit different, and we're going to work with Incus volumes to accomplish the data mapping, and that's really an interesting capability. Here we are on the Incus server, and if I do an Incus list, we have the GetMy application and also the Ghost application that I covered on the video before the GetMy application. And just as a reminder, if we do an LS, both the Ghost application and the GetMy application have folders on the host where they store their persistent data, because we know that when you stop a Docker application, the volatile data goes away unless it is stored in a persistent volume. Let's go ahead and wipe out the existing installation of GetMy, and we're going to do that with an Incus stop on GetMy and get-my-db. And then both of the containers are stopped. We'll go ahead and do an Incus delete on GetMy and GetMy database. And now if we do an Incus list, you'll see that we only have the Ghost application. The actual data for the GetMy application is still in existence, because if we do the ls, we can cd into get-my-data and do an ls down here, and you can see all of the data from that database. So let's go ahead and cd back to the top level, and let's do an rm-r. Actually, I'll have to do a sudo rm-r because the root account owns the folder. But I'm going to go ahead and do a sudo rm-r on get-my-data, and it will go ahead and delete that. So now we only have the Ghost persistent data, but we've deleted the containers for GetMy, GetMy database, and also the persistent data folder. In December of 2023, I did a video on LXD storage volumes. And this time we're going to talk a little bit about Incus storage volumes, which are really the same thing as LXD storage volumes. So you may not be aware of this, but every time you create a container, you're actually creating a volume. And we can look at those volumes by doing an Incus storage volume list default. The word default is because you have to list the name of the storage pool, and by default, the name of the default storage pool is default. So here I do an Incus list or Incus storage volume list default, and we end up with quite a few things. So we have a container volume for Ghost and a container volume for Ghost-DB, And we would also have a container volume for get my and get my database had I not deleted them. And then we have a whole bunch of file system volumes, which are simply images. And these are probably for when I've created containers in the past and then deleted them. And those container images get downloaded from linuxcontainers.org. And you can many times go back and delete them. There's one exception here, and you'll notice that this storage system is referred to as a block storage system rather than a file storage system. And more than likely, this was when I created a Incus virtual machine, because Incus virtual machine images are block-based file systems, whereas container file systems for OCI containers and regular Incus containers are just listed as being file systems. So if you go out and delete some of these, you'll of course save some disk space in your storage pool, but it's not necessary to do so. And in general, they're down here simply so that you don't have to end up repulling them every time you create a new container that has a requirement for a particular image. So now let's go ahead and create containers for the Get My application, just like we did in the last video. So we're going to do an Incus create docker :mongo :4.4, and we're naming the database container get-my-db. And then we're going and creating a container for the Get My application, and that comes from the Docker repository for Brian's applications, and we're getting the application called Get My, and we're getting the latest tag for it, and we're calling that container Get My. And again, we have the environment variable for Mongo _URL to point to the Get My database container, so that the application understands how to communicate with the database. At this point, last time we would have created the folder on the Incus host called get-my-data, and then we would have executed the command that you see here to add that particular source and destination folder for the persistent data. But this time, we're going to do this a bit differently, in that we're going to create an Incus storage volume, and we do that with Incus storage volume create default get-my-data. If we now list the volumes in the default storage pool with an Incus storage volume list default, and we scroll up here, we can see that we have a custom volume, and that's what it calls volumes that the end user creates. And we have a custom volume for get-my-data. Now we can associate the custom volume with our database container, and we do so with the command Incus storage volume attach. The Incus storage volume attach command attaches to a custom volume in the default storage pool, which is where we put the volume get-my-data, and get-my-data is the name of the volume we want to attach to, and the name of the container we want to attach that volume to is get-my-db, and then we want to attach or mount it to the folder /data/db, which is where the Mongo database stores its data. Just like in the last video, in order to make our application reachable, we have to set up a port proxy for port 3000 to make the Get My application accessible. Now we want to go ahead and start the database so that it's available for the application container. And we could do an Incus list, and we have the Get My database up and running. And now we should be able to start Get My with an Incus start get-my. And now if we do another Incus list command, we'll see that get-my and get-my database are running. And so now the data is no longer stored in a folder on the Incus host, but the database data is stored in the Incus custom volume. So at this point, we have a command called Incus storage volume info on the default storage pool and the volume get-my-data, and it will tell you what that usage is. Here we are up at my web browser at the address of my Incus server, which is 172.16.1.226, and I went to port 3000 by putting a :3000 on the end, and here is the get my application. So I go ahead and say login and register. We'll go ahead and type in my name, Scott. We'll go ahead and type in my email, vmsman@gmail.com. We'll type in my super secret password, and we'll go ahead and click register. And now we can go over to my list and list management. Go ahead and create a list called grocery, and then we'll click add. And in the grocery list, we'll go ahead and let's see, I guess we got to go back up here and go to list and then click on groceries, and then we go ahead and type in an item. So let's put in eggs and add eggs, and then let's go ahead and add water. And how about sour cream and heavy cream and lettuce, and add that. And of course we go back to the main screen. We can go back here to our list, go into our grocery list. We can cross out eggs because we bought eggs at the store, let's say. And let's drop back down to the terminal prompt and do the Incus storage volume info default on get my data again. And you can see that it has used a little bit more data than it had the first time, because it is actually storing data into that custom volume. Besides the volume info command, there is another command where you can say Incus storage volume show default on get my data, and that will give you general information about the container. So really, there isn't a lot of difference between an Incus container or an Incus OCI container or an Incus volume container. The difference is, though, that the Incus volume container is simply storing data and not an application. So we have here this get my data volume. It's a custom volume, and it says it's currently used by the instance get my data, which is the Docker OCI container we created for the database. Another interesting thing that we can do is we can do an Incus storage volume instead of show, an Incus storage volume edit in the default pool of get my data, which is the volume. And we can go down here to description and say data for Brian's get-my application. And then we can go ahead and do a Control-O and enter to save the file out, and a Control-X to exit the nano editor. And now we can do an Incus storage volume list default, and that will give us a list of all of our storage volumes. But you see here, it says we have a custom volume, get my data, but over here we have a description which says data for Brian's get my application. So that's handy to document what data might be stored in a custom volume. It's possible to connect more than one container to a custom volume. You just have to be aware of the fact that there's no file write access locking unless the application does it. So I'm going to create a simple container with an Incus launch images :ubuntu/2404, and I'm calling the container here test. And then we'll go ahead and connect to our get my data volume that we created with an Incus storage volume attached to the default storage pool, the custom volume get-my-data, and then we're connecting it to our container we just created called test, and we're connecting it to /data/db. And now if I do an Incus shell over to the test container, and then I cd over to data-db, I can do an ls, and there is all the Mongo database data that is being stored into the container. And I'll remind you that the get my application is connected to this location as well at the same time, but this is just a way for you to look at that data. Let's exit out of the test container, and we'll go ahead and do an Incus list. And just as a reminder, we're running test, which is the container we just created. We have the get my container and the get my database container. If we look over to the right, the test container is just a regular Incus container, whereas the other four are Incus OCI containers, and you can tell that because after container, it says parenthetically app. One of the best parts about using Incus custom storage volumes is that you can back them up just like you can back up Incus containers with the Incus export command. But in the case of a storage volume, we do an Incus storage volume export from the default pool. Get-my-data is the name of the storage volume we want to back up, and we're going to back it up to a file name of get-my-data.tar.gz. And of course, that could include a file path to go anywhere else. If we do an ls, there's the get-my-data.tar.gz backup of our custom storage volume for the get my application data. And of course, since we have an export command, we also have an import command. So here I'm going to do an Incus storage volume import default get-my-data.tar.gz, which is the name of the backup file we just created. And I'm going to import that to a custom volume called get-my-data-2. And I have to give it a different name because get-my-data is an existing volume and we had not deleted it. So I would have had to have deleted the old volume before I imported the volume if I wanted to restore a backup. So now let's do an Incus storage volume list default and see what we have here. And we have a get-my-data and a get-my-data-2. And notice that the description was carried over because the description was part of the backup. We can also delete a storage volume, and I'll delete the storage volume that I just imported with an Incus storage volume, delete default get-my-data-2, and it says that storage volume get-my-data-2 has been deleted. Just like we can perform snapshots for Incus containers, we can perform snapshots for Incus custom volumes. And we can do that with the command Incus storage volume snapshot create from the default pool get-my-data, which is the name of the custom volume, and my-snapshot is the name of the snapshot that I want to create. to see that it actually created a snapshot, we can always do an Incus storage volume info default on get-my-data. And here you can see that my-snapshot was created as the first snapshot. Another example is I could go out and create a second snapshot with an Incus volume snapshot create my-snapshot 2, and I can go out here and do the list again, and it will give that as well. One important consideration about snapshots, which also applies to containers, is whenever you do a snapshot of a custom volume, it increases the size of the custom volume because the snapshots are stored inside of the custom volume, just like snapshots for a container are stored inside of the container. We can delete an existing snapshot with the command Incus storage volume snapshot delete from the default storage pool, get-my-data, which is the name of the custom volume, and then my-snapshot. And it goes ahead and deletes that snapshot from that custom volume. And so we can look at the custom volume again and say Incus storage volume info default get-my-data, and you see that my snapshot is gone and my snapshot-2 remains. In order to delete a custom volume, you have to disassociate it from any containers that might be using it. So in this case, I'm going to do an Incus list, and we see we still have the test container. So I'm going to do an Incus stop on test. And then, since I no longer need the test container, and it was just created for this video, I'm going to do an Incus delete test. So the next thing I'll do is an Incus stop on get-my and get-my-db. And that'll go ahead and stop both of those. And now if I do an Incus list, you can see that test is gone and get-my is stopped and get-my database is stopped. At this point, you might assume that I can delete the custom volume with the command Incus storage volume delete default get-my-data, but the volume is still in use. And it's in use by the get-my-db because the database container is connected to the custom volume. So either we could disassociate it from the custom volume, or more likely in this particular case, I will do an Incus delete on get-my-db since it's no longer needed. And then I can do an Incus list, and we see that get-my-db is stopped or deleted, and get-my remains. But since get-my doesn't have any direct link to the custom storage volume, we're able to do an Incus storage volume delete default on get-my-data, and it successfully is deleted. So as it turns out, Incus custom volumes really provide a great role with Incus OCI containers because they allow you to store the data in a place inside of the storage pool that can be backed up, and it might be easier to keep track of them as opposed to having folders on your Incus host to store the same data. I hope this presentation on using Incus custom volumes with Incus OCI containers has been useful, and I hope you'll subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, and we'll see you next time.